Ethan's fingers tightened around the package as he pulled it from the mailbox. It was small, lightweight, wrapped in plain brown paper, and sealed with a single strip of tape. No return address. No markings. Just his name, printed in black ink. A cold unease crept up his spine. He hadn't ordered anything. No deliveries were expected. Who would send him something anonymously? He looked around. The street was empty. No suspicious cars, no unfamiliar faces. Just the quiet hum of a normal morning. Bringing the package inside, he set it on the kitchen counter and grabbed a knife to slice through the tape. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming that something was off. Then, with a sharp exhale, he pulled the box open. Inside was an old cassette recorder. Ethan frowned. It was an outdated, clunky model, something from the late 90s. Scratched but intact. No note. No explanation. Just the recorder. His pulse quickened as he reached out and pressed play. Static. Then his own voice. If you're listening to this, it's already too late. You can't escape. They're watching. Don't trust the police. And whatever you do, don't sign anything. Ethan felt his stomach drop. What the hell? His own voice. But he had never recorded this. His breath came in shallow gasps as the tape continued. There was a scuffle in the background, faint, but unmistakable. A chair scraping against the floor. A muffled grunt. Then, just before the recording cut out, a voice, low, rough, and unfamiliar, whispered, "If he doesn't sign, they die." The cassette clicked off. Ethan stared at the recorder, his hands clammy. His mind raced. This had to be a joke, a twisted prank. Someone had manipulated his voice, edited the recording. But the way it sounded, the urgency, the fear, it felt real. His phone vibrated against the counter. The sharp noise nearly made him jump. He grabbed it, glancing at the screen. No caller ID. The text message. "Stop looking. This is your only warning." A cold sweat broke across his forehead. His entire body tensed. Someone knew he was listening. Someone knew he had the recorder. He turned toward the window, his heart hammering. Outside, everything looked normal. But then he saw him, a man in a black trench coat, standing across the street, half hidden in the shade of a tree, watching. Ethan's breath hitched. He took an unconscious step back. The man didn't move. What the hell was happening? He wanted to believe this was paranoia, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. And whoever sent it, they were just getting started. Ethan clenched his fists. He had two options: ignore it and pretend none of this happened, or find out who was behind it. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. Instead, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. He knew just the person who could help him figure this out. Mark's apartment smelled like burnt coffee and something fried beyond recognition. Ethan barely noticed as he tossed the cassette recorder onto the table. "I need you to listen to this." Mark raised an eyebrow but picked up the recorder. "Dude, this thing is ancient." "What? Did you rob a thrift store?" "Just press play." Mark pressed the button. The room filled with Ethan's voice. The warning. The struggle. And then, "If he doesn't sign, they die." Silence. Mark slowly set the recorder down. "What the hell was that?" "That's me." Ethan swallowed hard. "But I never recorded it." Mark blinked, processing. Then his expression shifted, serious, calculating. "Okay, that's seriously messed up." He grabbed his laptop and cracked his knuckles. "Let's figure out where this came from." Ethan barely nodded, his mind still spinning. Then Mark froze. "Wait, what?" Mark rewound the tape, his brow furrowed. He turned up the volume, replaying the last few seconds. "Listen." Right before the whisper, Ethan strained to hear, and then he caught it. A faint rustling, almost like fabric brushing against a microphone. And just before the tape cut out, something even fainter. A second voice. "Make sure he gets it. He'll know what to do." Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. This was meant for him. And whoever sent it, they knew exactly who he was. He exchanged a glance with Mark, his heart pounding. Something told him this was just the beginning. Mark's fingers flew over the keyboard as he worked on enhancing the audio. The dim light of the laptop screen cast eerie shadows over his face. Ethan sat on the couch, gripping the recorder, his knee bouncing anxiously. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the air heavier. "Almost done," Mark muttered, dragging a noise filter over the waveform. "There's a lot of static, but I think I can isolate the voices." Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't know what he was hoping to find, but the unknown was worse than the truth. At least the truth had rules. Mark clicked play. The first part was the same. His own voice, the cryptic warning, the struggle. But then, beneath it all, something else. A whisper barely audible before. Make sure he gets it. He'll know what to do. Ethan leaned forward. Play that again. Mark rewound the audio, slowed it down. The words became clearer, but there was something else. A faint background noise, rhythmic, almost mechanical. What is that? Ethan frowned. Mark adjusted the frequencies. The sound became sharper. A bell. A small metallic ding, the kind you'd hear when someone walked into a store. Ethan's pulse quickened. That's a door chime. Mark nodded. And not just any chime. That's an old-school store bell. Ethan's mind worked fast. There's a shop not far from here. Dinson's Electronics. They deal in vintage tech. Mark looked skeptical. You think that's where this came from? Ethan clenched his jaw. It's the best lead we have. Mark hesitated, then nodded. Let's go. Vincent's Electronics was a relic of a bygone era. Dusty shelves stacked with outdated radios, cassette players, VHS tapes. The walls were covered in faded posters advertising brands that no longer existed. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood behind the counter. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. Help you? Ethan set the recorder down. I need to know who bought this. The man's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight twitch in his fingers. We don't track individual sales. Mark scoffed. Come on. You run a place like this. You remember faces. The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if weighing his options. Ethan leaned forward. This isn't a game. Someone sent this to me. Someone who thinks I know what to do. His voice hardened. Tell me who bought it. For a moment, it seemed like the man would deny knowing anything. Then finally he exhaled. A few days ago, guy came in, paid cash. Didn't want a receipt. Ethan's skin prickled. What did he look like? The man rubbed the back of his neck. Tall, black trench coat, kept his head down. I remember because he asked if we still carried blank tapes. Said he needed something that wouldn't be traced digitally. Ethan's stomach tightened. The man outside his house. The watcher. Did he say anything else? Mark asked. The shopkeeper hesitated, then lowered his voice. Yeah. Before he left, he told me, make sure it gets to the right person. He'll know what to do. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The exact words from the recording. His hands clenched into fists. Did he leave a name? Anything? The man shook his head. Yeah. And listen, if I were you, I'd drop this. The way he talked, this wasn't some collector looking for a cool gadget. This was business. And not the good kind. Ethan felt his heartbeat in his ears. The puzzle pieces were starting to form a picture. One he didn't like. He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, his phone buzzed. A new message. No caller ID. You're playing with fire. If you don't want the next tape delivered in a coffin, stop now. His grip tightened around the phone. His gut told him this wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Ethan's hands clenched around his phone, his breathing shallow as he reread the message. We know where he is. The choice is yours. His stomach churned. Mark wasn't answering his calls. The only thing Ethan knew for sure was that whoever had sent this message wasn't bluffing. They had Mark, and they expected Ethan to play along. But play along with what? He yanked the car into drive and peeled away from the curb, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The black car with tinted windows was still there. It had been following him since he left the electronics store. And now, with Mark missing, it didn't feel like a coincidence. His grip tightened on the wheel as he swerved onto a side street, cutting through back roads in an attempt to shake them. But no matter which turn he took, the car remained behind him. His heart pounded as he reached a red light. A second car pulled up alongside him. The driver, a man in a dark hoodie, glanced in his direction. Ethan's fingers hovered over his phone. He could call the police. But would they believe him? And even if they did, would it make things worse? The light turned green. He hesitated for half a second before slamming the gas and making an abrupt right. Tires screeched behind him as the black car followed, accelerating to match his speed. Ethan's pulse raced. He had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. They weren't letting him go. He swerved into a parking garage, darting between cars and cutting his headlights. He parked behind a concrete pillar and watched as the black car rolled in a few seconds later, slowly cruising through the rows. He held his breath. The car slowed near his section, its tinted windows preventing him from seeing inside. Then, After what felt like an eternity, it kept moving. A few moments later, it exited the garage. Ethan exhaled, his hands trembling against the wheel. That was too close. He couldn't just drive straight to Mark's apartment now. If they were watching him, they'd expect that. He needed another way in. Slipping out of the garage, he took a longer route, circling around side streets until he reached Mark's building from the back. He parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the way on foot, keeping his head down. As soon as he stepped inside the building, he knew something was wrong. The hallway was eerily quiet. The door to Mark's apartment was slightly open. His pulse spiked. He pushed it open fully, stepping inside. The place was a wreck. The coffee table was shattered, the couch overturned. A lamp lay on the floor, flickering, casting long shadows against the walls. A chair was knocked over, one of its legs broken off. Mark was gone. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the room. This wasn't just a break-in. This was deliberate. Someone had been looking for something, or someone, and they had taken Mark. On the table, amidst the chaos, something stood out. A cassette recorder. His stomach twisted. He hesitated only for a moment before pressing play. Mark's voice crackled through the speaker, raw with fear. "They need you. They said you know what to do. I don't know what's going on, but damn it, don't do anything stupid. These people are serious." The tape cut out. Ethan's hands curled into fists. His breath was ragged. They had taken Mark because of him, because they thought Ethan knew something. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "We'll be in touch." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He needed a plan. First, who were they? What did they want? His foot knocked against something. A phone. Mark's. Ethan grabbed it and powered it on. The screen was cracked, but still functional. The last opened app was messages. The most recent text was from an unknown number. "Tell him to stop digging. Last warning." Ethan's jaw clenched. He wasn't stopping. He couldn't. His eyes darted around the apartment, searching for anything useful. A laptop sat on the counter, the screen dark. He tapped the touchpad. The login screen popped up. Password protected. Of course. He shoved the phone into his pocket and turned toward the door, but something outside caught his attention. A shadow moved in the hallway. Ethan froze. Someone was out there. His mind raced. If they were watching him, they'd expect him to panic, to run. Instead, he moved slowly, silently, inching toward the door. He positioned himself against the wall, out of sight. A soft creak. The floorboards in the hall groaned under the weight of careful steps. Then silence. Ethan's fingers tightened into fists. He needed a weapon. His eyes darted around the room. A broken chair leg. He grabbed it, holding it tight. Another creak. Closer. Then suddenly, the door slammed open. A figure lunged inside, moving fast. Ethan swung. The chair leg connected with a solid thud, and the intruder stumbled back, cursing. Ethan didn't wait. He charged, slamming into the figure, sending them both crashing to the ground. They grappled, struggling for control. Ethan landed a punch, his knuckles slamming against the intruder's jaw. A grunt, a knee to his ribs. Ethan gasped as pain shot through his side. The intruder scrambled to their feet, reaching into their jacket. A flash of metal, a gun. Ethan reacted on instinct. He kicked upward, knocking the gun from their grip, clattered across the floor. The figure hesitated for half a second, then bolted. Ethan lunged for the gun, gripping it tight, but by the time he looked up, the intruder was gone. He sucked in deep breaths, his ribs aching. His hands trembled around the gun. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't a fighter. His phone buzzed. A new message. "This was your warning. Next time we don't miss." Ethan's grip tightened around the weapon. They thought they could scare him. They thought he'd run. They were wrong, because now it was personal. Ethan barely slept that night. His mind was a storm of questions, fear, and anger. Mark was out there somewhere, held hostage by people who thought he knew something worth killing for. The gun he had taken from the intruder lay on his nightstand. He had never even held one before last night, and now it was the only thing between him and whoever was coming next. At sunrise, his doorbell rang. A chill ran down his spine. He checked the peephole. No one was there. His stomach tightened as he slowly opened the door. A small package sat on his doormat. Ethan knelt down, hands slightly shaking as he picked it up. No return address. No markings. Just his name. He locked the door behind him and placed the package on his kitchen table, staring at it as if it might explode. He knew what this was. Another message. Another threat. Ripping it open, he found a manila envelope filled with documents. On top was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note in bold black ink. You know what to do. You have 24 hours. Sign it or he dies. Ethan's breath came out sharp and uneven as he flipped through the papers. A legal contract, dense with fine print. His eyes skimmed over the words, but one phrase stood out like a dagger to the chest. Transfer of full ownership rights. They were trying to take everything from him. His business. Ethan gritted his teeth, scanning further. If he signed, he'd lose all control, his company, his assets, everything. But if he didn't sign, his stomach turned. They weren't bluffing. A separate page contained instructions, coordinates leading to an undisclosed location where he would deliver the signed contract in person. No police. No backup. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had built his business from the ground up. It wasn't a corporate empire, but it was his. The only thing he had ever truly owned. And now someone wanted to take it away. He had no idea who they were or why they wanted it, but they were willing to kill for it. The day passed in slow, suffocating silence. Ethan felt trapped between two impossible choices. Save his friend and lose everything, or refuse and risk Mark's life. By evening, his phone buzzed. Another message. Time's up. Come alone. He stared at the screen. He had spent the entire day debating his next move, and now he was out of time. His hands clenched into fists. They think I'm just going to roll over. They think they've already won. Not yet. Ethan tucked the gun into his waistband, grabbed the contract, and left. The coordinates led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place no one would hear a gunshot. Rusted metal doors loomed ahead, slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Ethan parked a block away, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of oil and damp concrete. Faint light flickered from hanging bulbs, casting jagged shadows across the cavernous space. The only sound was the distant hum of the wind outside. And then footsteps. A group of men emerged from the darkness. 5 of them, dressed in black. No masks. No ruse. They moved like men who weren't afraid. Like men who had already decided how this night would end. And in the center of it all, Mark, tied to a chair, his face bruised, his lips split. He looked up at Ethan, his expression filled with both relief and warning. Ethan swallowed hard. One of the men stepped forward. Tall, cold, sharp eyes. He held out a pen. Your choice, Ethan. Ethan's heart pounded as he took a slow step closer. His mind was running on overdrive. I need time. I need an opening. He reached for the contract, pretending to study the text. He flipped a page. Another. The words blurred together. Tick-tock. The man's voice was ice. Sign it, or we put a bullet in your friend's head. Ethan gripped the pen. Then sirens. The sharp wail of approaching police cars sliced through the air. The men tensed. Mark had done something. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved. Chaos exploded. One of the men lunged toward him, but Ethan was faster. He swung the contract folder straight into his face, sending him staggering back. The others scrambled, some reaching for weapons, but the warehouse flooded with flashing red and blue lights as police vehicles screeched to a stop outside. The men bolted. Ethan rushed to Mark, yanking at the ropes binding his wrists. His hands were slick with sweat, his breathing ragged. Can you walk? Mark nodded, though he looked weak. Yeah, let's move. Ethan threw Mark's arm over his shoulder, dragging him toward the exit. Tires screeched outside. The men were escaping. The contract lay abandoned on the floor. And signed. Ethan didn't look back. It was over. Ethan's grip on the pen tightened, sweat gathering at his brow. The air in the warehouse was thick, the scent of oil and damp concrete mingling with something far worse. Fear. The contract lay open in front of him, the ink dry, waiting for his signature. The men surrounding him stood still, their guns at their sides, but the real threat wasn't them. It was the man in the black trench coat, the one who hadn't moved, the one who had orchestrated everything. Mark let out a ragged breath, the knife at his throat pressing just enough to draw a thin line of blood. The man holding him wasn't bluffing. Ethan knew that. One wrong move and Mark would be gone. The trench coat man tilted his head slightly. Sign it. Now. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, a quiet menace that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Ethan's mind raced. He needed a way out. He had seconds. His fingers hovered over the paper. Then sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder. The tension in the room shifted. The men looked at each other, uneasy. The leader's jaw clenched. Ethan saw his moment. With a sudden, explosive movement, he slammed his elbow backward, crushing it into the ribs of the nearest guard. The man let out a strangled grunt, stumbling just enough for Ethan to grab his gun. Before anyone could react, Ethan spun, aiming directly at the man in the trench coat. "It's over." His voice was steady, his breath controlled, but his hands were slick with sweat. For the first time, the leader looked surprised, but just for a second. Then he smiled. Mark's captors hesitated. The sirens were deafening now. Red and blue lights flickered through the cracks in the warehouse walls. The trench coat man took a slow step forward. "You think this ends with you?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "You think you've won?" Ethan didn't flinch. Then the doors exploded inward. SWAT officers poured in. Shouts filled the air. "Drop your weapons. On the ground. Now." The room erupted into chaos. The men bolted. Some tried to fight back, but it was too late. The police were everywhere. Mark yanked himself free, gasping as he stumbled forward. Ethan grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. A gunshot rang out behind them, but it wasn't aimed at them. One of the criminals had fired blindly in a desperate attempt to escape. The trench coat man didn't move, even as the officers forced him onto his knees, even as they wrenched his hands behind his back. He just watched Ethan. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something almost amused. Ethan didn't stop. He didn't look back. The contract lay crumpled on the floor, and signed, "Useless." It was over. The interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and sweat. Ethan sat stiffly in the chair, his mind still racing despite the adrenaline wearing off. Across from him, a detective flipped through a thick file, his expression unreadable. "You understand what you just walked into, right?" the detective finally said, closing the folder. "These men weren't small time. This was organized. And we still don't know why they wanted your company." Ethan swallowed hard. "Neither do I." The detective studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if he was lying. "We ran the contracts they sent you. Shell companies, offshore accounts. Someone wanted full control of everything you own, but the paper trail disappears the second you follow it." Ethan felt the weight of that settle in his chest. This wasn't about money. This wasn't even about his business. It was about something bigger. "Is he talking?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter than before. The detective didn't need to ask who he meant. He just shook his head. "Not a word." Ethan exhaled. Of course, the man in the trench coat had never been the type to break under pressure. He knew this wasn't the last he'd hear of him. The city felt different when Ethan stepped outside the police station. The streets were the same. The buildings, the neon signs, the hum of life, unchanged. But Ethan, he had walked into something he was never supposed to survive. And yet, here he was. Mark leaned against a parked car, looking rough but very much alive. "Man," he sighed, rubbing a sore spot on his wrist. "We gotta stop getting into this kind of trouble." Ethan let out a breath, almost a laugh. "Yeah, no kidding." Mark gave him a sideways glance. "So, what now?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the city, watching the way the lights flickered against the dark sky. "Now," he exhaled, "now I go home." That night, Ethan sat by his window, staring at the skyline. Everything felt different, because it was. He had almost lost everything. His life, his business, his best friend. But he had won. He had fought back against something far bigger than him, something he still didn't fully understand. His eyes drifted to the mailbox outside. For a long moment he debated checking it. Finally he stood and walked to the door. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped onto the porch. The mailbox was empty. No tapes. No threads. Nothing. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled. For the first time in days he felt like he could breathe.